Welcome back to On the Same Page. We are on Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph, 13a of Maseches Kiddushin. We are about 12 lines from the bottom. It's where the Gemara lines are the medium-sized lines. The first of the medium-sized lines, the first word on the page is Ha. It says Hadol Shadach. Then the Gemara says Kinach Nafshei de Rav Asi. When Rav Asi passed away, Ailu Rabbanan Lin Kutinhu Lishmaitze. The rabbis, the students of Rav Asi, they gathered together to gather his Torah, his teachings. They wanted to make sure that their tradition was intact, and Rashi says they gather in the Beis Medrash. They say anybody who's heard something, that maybe we haven't heard yet from Rav Asi should say it over. And that way they would make sure that his teachings weren't forgotten. So, Amar Leah Hume Rabbanan, one of the rabbis there, Rabbi Yaakov Shmei, his name was Rabbi Yaakov, he said, Hachi Amar Rav Asi Amar Rav Mani. Rav Asi said the following, this is one of the things that Rav Asi taught. And he said it in the name of Rav Mani, that Kishem She'ein Isha Niknis V'Pachos Mishava Pruta, just as a woman cannot be acquired as a wife for less than a shava pruta, a pruta value for the Kiddushin, kach ein karka niknis b'pachos mishava pruta. So too, you can't acquire a piece of land for less than a shava pruta. Amrulei, they said to him, v'hatanya, but we learned in a brisa that it seems to say otherwise. The brisa says, apa pi she'ein isha niknis b'pachos mishava pruta, Karka niknis b'pachos mishava pruta. It says the exact opposite. The brisa says even though a woman can't be acquired for less than a shava pruta, but land could be acquired for less than a shava pruta. It's exactly opposite of what the Rabbi Yaakov is reporting that he heard from Rav Asi in the name of Rav Mani. So Amar Le, or Amar Lahu, he said back to them, Kitanya hahi b'chalipin. When the Brisa says that you can acquire karka, you can acquire land for less than a shava pruta, it's not using the kinyan of kesef, it's not using the method of acquisition of money, it's using it ta'i b'chalipin. Now it's talking about chalipin, the kinyan where you make an exchange. Titania, like we learned in a Brisa, konin b'kli, you can acquire using a vessel, even though that vessel is not worth a shava pruta. So we've touched on this in the past, that there's one way to acquire things is with kasef, with money, but there's another type of kinyan called chalipin, and chalipin works more like an exchange, and when you use the method of chalipin, then the item does not have to be worth a shava pruta. So you can take even a kli that's worth even less than a shava pruta, even less than a pruta, and you raise it up and acquire it, and at the moment that you acquire it, your piece, in this case your land, would go to the buyer. So he gives you his pen or his yarmulke or his handkerchief. It's traditionally done with a sudar, with a handkerchief. He gives you his handkerchief. You lift it up, and that makes the exchange. And in the handkerchief or the cloth or whatever you're using does not have to be worth the shava pruta. That's what the brisa was talking about. But if they were trying to make that kinyan, that acquisition using money, then the money that they used would have to be worth at least a pruta. The Gemara continues. It says, Hadar Yasvi. They continued to sit v'ka'amri, and they said further another thing from Rav Asi. They said, Hada Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. That which Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, Kol she'eno yodea b'tiv gitin v'kiddushin, lo yehe lo esek imahem. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, anybody who doesn't really know tiv gittin, he doesn't know the halachos of gittin, of get, of divorce, and kiddushin, of betrothal, he doesn't know them well, lo yehe lo esek imam, he shouldn't have dealings with them, meaning he shouldn't oversee them. The rabbi who's overseeing the get or the kiddushin, the marriage, if he doesn't have proper knowledge of it, he shouldn't be dealing with it. Rav Asi, so that was what Rav Shmuel said. That's what Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel. And on that, Rav Asi said, Rav Asi, Rav Yochanan, in the name of Rav Yochanan, V'kashim la'olam yoser midor hamabel. And somebody who has such dealings, if a rabbi overseas get a divorce or a marriage and he doesn't have proper knowledge of how it's done, he creates a situation that's worse than the generation of the flood, the generation of Noach. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, the verse says in Hosea, it says, Allah v'kichesh, Allah v'chachesh. He swears and he lies, he swears falsely, v'ratzoach, and murder, v'ganov, and stealing, v'naof, and adultery. And then it says, paratzu, and this is the key word here, but we'll see what it means here, but for now we'll leave it untranslated. Paratzu sounds like it means like they've breached. They breached, v'damim nagu, and blood has touched blood. So what does this mean? What is this verse talking about? So talking about, certain, obviously, sins and transgressions of swearing falsely and murder and stealing and na'of. But what about this paratzu? So the Gemara says, my mashma. What's the implication of this? What does it mean? Kiddushin Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef translated, based on the Targum Yonasan, Rashi says, the translation of paratzu is molden banin minashe chavrehan, that they birth children from their friends' wives. Meaning, the word paratzu is like, Rashi says, like we find in Parshas Shmos, the word v'chein yifrotz, that they've expanded, and they're growing in number, they're giving birth. So here too, that's what it means. They're giving birth. Paratzu is molden banin, they're having children, and it's talking about where they're having children from the wives of their friends. And what happens is chovin al chovin mosifin. The end of the pasuk said, damim b'damim nago, blood touches blood. What that means, the Targum says, is they've increased transgression upon transgression. And how is it that they're having children from their friends' wives? It's because the divorces were improper. The gitting were done improperly. So we see that this pasuk refers to the errors that can occur from mistakes by the overseeing rabbis when it comes to divorce, or potentially marriage can, if somebody thinks they're not married when they are. So there can be errors that come up, and then it's a disaster because the results just build on themselves, and it's chovin al chovin mosifin. It adds error on error because transgression upon transgression, because it's never really dealt with. So what about all this? Why is this worse? How do we see that it's worse than the dor hamabel, than the generation of the flood? Uksiv, because then the pasuk goes on in the next verse in Hosea, and it says, Al kain te'avel ha'aretz. Therefore, te'avel ha'aretz, the land should mourn. The umlal kol yoshev ba, and all those who dwell should be saddened. And then it says, B'chayas hasadeh, with the animals of the field, v'of hashamayim, and the birds of the heavens, v'gam dagei hayam ye'asefu, and also the fish will be gathered, will die. So it says that as a result, the land will mourn, and it seems like it's saying the animals will die. The animals, the fish, the birds and the fish. So that's similar to what happened in the Dor HaMabul, in the generation of the flood, where also the animals died in the flood. Those that were not saved in the Teva, in the ark. But v'ilu b'Dor HaMabul, but by the Dor HaMabul, by the generation of the flood, lo nigzera gezera al dagim shebayam. It did not, the gezera, the decree did not include the fish at sea. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, mikol asher becharava mesu. that everything on the dry land died, v'lo dagim shebayam, but not the fish. V'ilu hacha, but here, afilu dagim shebayam, even the fish will die. The Navi is prophesizing that even the fish will die as a result of these grave sins. So what you see is that these errors in regarding laws of marriage, these paratzu, the molden banim, the giving birth of children from illicit relationships, is going to cause destruction that will include even the fish, and that's worse than the Dora Mabel, where the fish were not included in the decree. Asks the Gemara, Ve'ima ad da'avid l'kulu. Maybe the verse means that you have to do all those things before these punishments come. Meaning the Gemara is assuming that just by making errors in divorce and having children born from other people's wives, that just from that these disasters will occur. Ask the Gemara, there's a whole list. Maybe you need to fulfill the whole list of swearing falsely and murder and stealing and adultery. So maybe it's all of them. Says the Gemara, lo salka daitach. No, don't think that. Tichsiv, because the pasuk says in Yirmiyah, it says ki mipnei eile avla haaretz. Just adultery on its own is enough to bring this about. And so you see that to bring about the mourning in the land. So you see that just one error of the list is really enough, and so it doesn't have to be all of them. Just one thing on the list. In this case, it's adultery. This is seemingly deliberate adultery, not what we're talking about. That this is niyuf, not what we're talking about, which amounts to adultery, but it's through errors, through mistakes. But just like niyuf on its own will bring about these occurrences, so too swearing falsely, and so too murder, and so too the bearing children from friends' wives, from divorces that were not really properly carried out. Asks the Gemara, ve'ema eile lechud v'hanach lechudehon. It says, maybe it's just singling out this one, and really meaning, I guess, adultery, and really all the other ones are needed together. I mean, maybe this is one thing, but the other ones all have to come together, and really on its own, the paratzu, the marriages that are done in error, maybe that's not enough on its own. It needs the other ones with it. So the Gemara says, no, miksiv uparatzu, paratzu ksiv. It says no. Does it say and paratzu and bearing children through mistaking marriages? No, it says paratzu on its own without the vav, without joining it to the previous ones. So each one stands independently. The pasuk says, Allah v'kichesh, swearing falsely, v'ratzach, and murder, v'ganav, and stealing, v'nauf, and adultery, paratzu. And then it doesn't have a vav there. Paratzu stands on its own, and therefore, since it doesn't join with the other one, so it's clear that it can stand alone, and on its own, it can bring about these punishments. And Rashi actually says, and it's only about that the pasuk then goes on and speaks out these punishments. So it seems that I guess perhaps the Gemara was asking that it's assuming that the Gemara seems to be assuming actually that these punishments are only for this last thing, because that's the whole thing. We're saying this one thing, making mistakes in marriages and divorces, is worse than the Dora Mabel. Well, what about the rest of the things in the list? The murder and the... So the Gemara is actually assuming that this last thing stands alone. This last thing stands alone. And therefore, it points that out, it makes that clear, because it doesn't say uparat, it doesn't join it to the previous ones. It says it on its own. It lists off all these sins that were going on, but then it says, just without the vav, it says paratsu. These, by bringing about illicit marriages, children from women who are married to other men. So that alone brings about the punishments that appear afterwards in the verse. Okay, that was another teaching that emerged from Rav Asi that they passed on from Rav Asi, that that having mistakes in Gittin and Kiddushin can be worse than what occurred in the generation of the flood. Says the Gemara, Hadr Yasvi, then they sat V'Ka'amri, and they said the following, Haditnan, that which we learned, Ha'isha shehivia chatasa umesa, a woman who has a child, so she brings two karbanos, she brings a chatas and an ola. So let's say she brought her karban chatas, her sin offering, and then she died. So then she never had a chance to bring her ola. So the Mishnah says, Yaviu yarshin olasa. Her heirs, her inheritors bring her karban ola. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, V'hu sheifrishta mechayim. When is it that the children, the heirs of the woman would bring a karban ola on her behalf? If she dies before she has a chance to bring it, that's if she already separated the animal and designated it while she was still alive. Avaloi frishta mechayim. But if she never designated an animal for the ola, then the heirs would not have to bring the karban on her behalf. That's what Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel. Alma kasavar shibuda lav de araisa. So we see that he holds that there's no lien from the Torah, meaning if shibuda was de araisa, if a person's possessions, if the Torah created a lien on one's possessions automatically, so then as soon as she becomes obligated in this karban, but when she has her baby, then there would be a lien on her possessions, and the heirs would have to take from their inheritance to bring a karban on her behalf. The fact that Shmuel said, Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, that if she never designated an animal, then they don't have to do it. They don't have to bring a karban. Sounds like there's no lien on her possessions. But now we have Rav Asi's statement. Rav Asi, Rabbi Yochanan, no, even though she never designated an animal for the ola, the heirs would be responsible to bring a karban ola on behalf of their mother or whoever the heirs are. Alma, so we see, Kasavar Shibuda Havadaraisa. It sounds like Rav Asi, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, holds that Shibud, that a lien is daraisa. The Torah creates a lien on her possessions to require now the heirs to bring a karban on her behalf from her possessions. Says the Gemara, very nice that they're arguing about this, but the truth is, this seems superfluous because they already argued about this. What we have here is Shmuel holding, Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel holding that the Torah puts a lien on someone's property, and we have Rav Asi in the name of Rabbi Yochanan saying that it does not. So the Gemara says, we already know that they have this machlokas. De Rav Shmuel, de Amri Tarvayu, because both Rav and Shmuel say, milva al peh, if a person lends money without a document, there's a loan, an oral loan, Eina gova min hayarshin, v'lo min halakuchos. When you want to collect that loan, you're not allowed to collect it from the heirs if the person died, or from the lakuchos, from people who purchased a field. So basically, he's saying that a milva al peh, an oral loan, does not create a lien on the property. So therefore, if I borrow money, if Reuven borrows money from Shimon, and then Shimon dies, so then Reuven cannot go since it was an oral loan, Reuven cannot go to Shimon's heirs and say, oh, your father owed me money. The same is true if Shimon didn't die, he just sold all his property to a third party. So now Reuven wants to collect can he go can the creditor go and say, oh, there's a lien on this property, I want to collect it? The answer is that by a milva al peh, by an oral loan, you may not. That's the opinion of Shmuel and Rav. Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, but Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, to Amri Taivayu, they both say milva al peh gova min hayarshin. They say that a milva al peh, by an oral loan, you are allowed to collect from the heirs. Gova bein min hayarshin bein min halakuchos. Both from the inheritors and from buyers, if someone buys the field. So there is a lien according to them, and therefore you could go to the heirs to collect your money. You could go to someone who bought property from the borrower to collect the money. There is a lien on the property. So we see. So it seems superfluous. We have them having this machlokes, Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan, with regards to whether the woman who dies, whether her heirs have to bring a carbon from her possessions, and we have it whether a creditor is allowed to go after the yarshin, the inheritors, or after someone who bought the field to collect his money. So we already know they argue about this lien. So the Gemara says tricha, but we still need to tell us both of these different scenarios. Didi itmar baha, because if the Torah, if we only knew that if we only had this machlokas, this dispute mentioned in the context of a loan, so I might have said bahaka amar Shmuel. Maybe here, this is where Shmuel says that there's no lien on the property by a loan, or a loan. Mishum delo milvek suva batarahi. Because this loan isn't written in the Torah, this obligation isn't written in the Torah anywhere. The Torah doesn't create this, he created this himself by lending the money. Aval bahach, but in the case of the carbon, ema moda l'hu Rabbi Yochanan l'Reish Lakish. Since that obligation is created by the Torah on her, that she has to bring that carbon. When she has a baby, she now has to bring a carbon. So the Torah creates that obligation. So maybe here Shmuel would agree to Rabbi Yochanan that there is a lien on her property. That's what I might have thought to say. That's why we need Shmuel to say, despite that, no, there's no lien on the property, there's no shibud midaraisa. The Torah does not create a lien on her property, and the yarshin, if she never designated an animal, the inheritors do not have to bring a carbon on her behalf. Ve'iyashma'inan baha, and if they had only taught us that they have a machlokas, that they have this dispute with regards to the carbon, whether the children have to bring the carbon, that Shmuel says that they do not, and Rabbi Yochanan says that they do, and that there is a lien. B'hakam Rabbi Yochanan, maybe I'd say that's where Rabbi Yochanan said that they have to bring the carbon, that there's a lien on her property. Demilvek ksuva b'Torah ksuva b'shtar damya. Because a loan that's written in the Torah is like a loan that's written in a document. Everybody agrees that if you lend money with a document, if there's a shtar, if there's a bill, if there's if it's recorded, that loan, then everybody agrees there's a lien. Unless it says explicitly that there's not. But normally there's a lien on a written document. So therefore, I would say that this obligation, which is written in the Torah, is like a written document. That's why there's a lien on the possessions of the inheritors, and that's why they have to bring the carbon. That's what Rabbi Yochanan might have said. Aval b'hach, but maybe by a milva al peh or a loan, ema modale l'Shmuel. Maybe Shmuel would agree. Maybe Rabbi Yochanan would agree to Shmuel that there's no lien on the property. Maybe by an oral loan he'd agree. It's not written anywhere. It's not like it's written in the Torah. It's not like it's written on a shtar, on a document. And therefore maybe he would agree that there's no lien on the property. Tricha. That's why I need both scenarios. We need to be taught that they argue in both scenarios. That Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan argue about whether there's a lien on the property, both when it comes to bringing a carbon and when it comes to a oral loan. Amar Rav Papa. Rav Papa said, Hilchasa, what's the halacha? How do we paskin? Rav Papa said the halacha is milva al peh gova min hayarshin. The halacha is that a milva al peh, an oral loan, you're allowed to collect from yarshin, from heirs, ve'eno gova min alakuchos. But you may not collect it from buyers. Gova min yarshin, you're allowed to collect from heirs shibuda doraisa, because behold that really there is a lien created by the Torah, and therefore if Reuven lends money to Shimon, and then Reuven dies, then Shimon dies, Reuven lends money to Shimon, and then Shimon dies, Reuven can go to Shimon's heirs to collect the money, because the property, all of Shimon's property has a lien on it. And Reuven can even go collect it from Shimon. Even by a milva al peh, even by a oral loan. However, ve'eno gova min alakuchos, we still don't allow him to buy from buyers, deles le'kala, because there's no call, there's no voice, it's not known that there was a lien on the property, and therefore the chachamim, they got takana, they made a decree, then they do not allow the lender to go to buyers in order to collect his loan in a situation of an oral loan. That's the Rabbanan said that's a risk that you're taking upon yourself by not creating a document. But ideally you should make a document, because then everybody will know that there's a lien on the property. That's public, and then the buyer, whoever buys from this guy, should know that there's a lien, and they're accepting that, and that's why. And in that case, if there's a document, you'd be allowed to go and collect from them. But in a situation where where it's an oral loan, and that we say people don't really know about it, people don't hear about it, and therefore the Chachamim said, even though Shibud is Doraisa, even though according to the Torah there is a lien on the property, but the Chachamim said you're not allowed to go and collect from buyers. If somebody buys the field, you cannot go and confiscate it from them. Okay, the next part of the Mishnah said, V'kones atzma beget v'misas habal. It said that a woman reacquires herself with either a get, a bill of divorce, she becomes unmarried then, v'misas habal, as well as if the husband dies. So the Gemara says, Bishlam a get, I understand get, meaning I know about that, Dechsiv, it's a pasuk. V'kasav la sefer krisus. Torah says he writes for her a bill of divorce, and then it says, and she could go and marry someone else. So we see that once he gives her a get, then she is now available to marry someone else, and she's reacquired herself. Ela misa sabal min olam. But how do I know that if a husband dies, then now the woman is allowed to marry someone else? Maybe she remains chained to him forever. Maybe once she's married to him, she's always married to him unless they get divorced. But if he dies, then it's too late, and she can't marry someone else. So the Gemara says, Svarahu. The Gemara says it's logical. I don't need a pasuk to teach me that it's obvious. Hu asra, hu sharsa. He forbade her. Why is it obvious? Because he forbade her by being married to her, and now he releases her, because the whole point is that she is tied to him, and at this point, she's no longer tied to him because he's no longer around. So the Gemara says, it's very nice, but we see that that's not exactly the case always. Because when it comes to certain arayos, certain forbidden relationships, they're true even after death. So for example, a man is not allowed to marry his father's wife, right? So a man can't marry his father's wife. Meaning, even if the father dies, that woman is forbidden forever to the son. So you see that even, death do us part, but there's still, even after death, there's not a complete separation. And she's still viewed as related. So maybe that's true for any husband, maybe for any man that dies, who says the woman isn't still tied to that husband? Who says that she's now allowed to go and marry someone else? So the Gemara says, Ella, so rather, what's the source that she's allowed to marry someone else? Mida amar rachmana yevama she'en la banim asura. Because the Torah says that a yevama, a woman whose husband dies without children, So the Torah says she's not allowed to marry someone else unless she gets chalitza. But if she doesn't get chalitza, then the alternative is yibum. She marries the brother. But the fact that she's asura, hayesh labanim mutaris. But we see that if she would have children, she would be allowed to marry someone else. So we see that when her husband dies, it's only when he dies without children that she can't marry someone else, implying that if she died with children, then she could. So we see that normally when a husband dies, the woman can remarry. The Gemara says, who says? The Dilma maybe ein labanim asur la'alma v'sharya liyava. Maybe if she has no children, she can't marry someone else. But the Torah is teaching us, but she's allowed to marry the brother. She's allowed to marry the yavam. V'yesh labanim. But if she has children, l'kuli alma nami asura. Maybe if she has children, she's forbidden to marry anyone. Maybe that's the wrong deduction. Maybe what the Torah is teaching us is if she has no children, she can marry the brother. If she has children, she can't marry anyone. Maybe that's what the Torah is telling us. So how do we know that she's allowed to marry someone else? Or how do we know that a woman whose husband dies is allowed to remarry? The fact that the Torah specifically says that a Kohen Gadol is not allowed to marry a widow. He's the only one who can't marry a widow. The Kohen Gadol. So from the fact that the Torah says that a Kohen Gadol cannot marry a widow, Hala Kohen Hediot Sharia, it sounds like a regular Kohen and anybody else, a non-Kohen, could marry a widow. So we see that you're allowed to, when a widow, a man who dies, his wife is allowed to remarry. It says the Gemara, "V'dilma l'kohen gadol b'lav l'kul yama b'aseh." No, maybe what it's saying is that the Kohen Gadol has a lav. Kohen Gadol has a negative commandment that he can't marry an almana. But maybe for everyone else, it's an aseh. Meaning that Rashi explains, when it comes to divorce, the pasuk says, Kasav Sefer Krisus, he writes her a bill of divorce, and then she goes and remarries someone. It sounds like there's a positive commandment for her to go and remarry. Now we're not saying that there is, but it sounds like it. So maybe it's saying she should go and remarry after a divorce with them. But anyone else, meaning a widow, should not remarry. And maybe it's actually an aseh, it's a lav haba mechal aseh. From the fact that it says she should remarry by a divorce, it's implying but she shouldn't remarry by a death, for a widow. So maybe that it's actually forbidden for her. So the Gemara says, Ha yaseh ma yavite. What will be the purpose of such an aseh? It says, Ida hanya misas abal tishtri legamri. Right now, while she's married, we know she can't marry someone else. Right? That she's married, she can't marry someone else. So if the husband's death works to release her, so then why is there an assay on her? She should be allowed to go and remarry someone else. And if the husband's death does not work to release her, then we should just say she's still married. She's an eshes ish. It's not just an assay. It's a chiyuv misa. It's a death penalty. It's a serious thing. It's adultery. Meaning, how do we look at her? Is she still married or not? If she's not married, she should be allowed to marry someone else. If she is still married, even though her husband died, then she's still married. She's a married woman, and it's adultery. So it wouldn't be an aseh, and therefore, from the fact that the Torah specifically forbids a Kohen Gadol, but not someone else, it sounds like other people can marry a widow. So the Gemara says, well, who says? The Gemara says, Alam Allah, why not? Alam Allah, ficta mimisa v'kimta alaseh. It says, maybe not. Maybe what it's saying is that when she dies, when he dies, she's no longer misa, she won't get killed, it's not adultery, but maybe there's an aseh. Maybe there's a positive commandment that says she shouldn't get married. Only after a divorce you get married, but a widow doesn't remarry. Maybe that's what it's saying. What's wrong with that? Midi dahava psulia mukdashim. We find a similar thing by a karban that became pasul. Demeikara isbehu me'ila. When you have a karban, before you, if something goes wrong with the animal and you can't bring the karban, or before that even, So there's me'ilah, you can't benefit from it. There's a commandment not to benefit from it. Vastir begiza v'avod, and you also can't benefit by shearing it or you can't work it. But parkinu, but if it's puzzle for a carbon, so then you redeem it. And when you redeem it, me'ilah lesbu, at that point there's no me'ilah. You're allowed to benefit from it. You could eat it, you could shecht it and eat it, but begiza v'avoda asiri. But you still can't shear it or work it, because it used to be a carbon, but you could eat it. So it's downgraded. It's downgraded. It used to be that there was me'ilah on it. Now there's no me'ilah. It used to be you couldn't benefit at all. Now you're allowed to benefit. You could eat it after you've redeemed it. So there also we have this idea of like a downgrade. So it says maybe here also there's a downgrade. When her husband is alive, it's a chiyuv misa. And when and after he dies, maybe it downgrades to an assay, to a positive commandment not to remarry. So rather, what's the source that a widow can remarry? Mida amar kra, because the pasuk says that a man who goes to war, one of the people that gets to go back and doesn't have to go to war is a man who just got married, or he was betrothed, Kiddushin, and he didn't marry her yet. So we tell him, go back home to marry her, lest he die and another man will take his wife. So we see, this is at least talking about where there's Erusin, where they're already betrothed, that when he dies, we have Ish Acher Yikachena, somebody else might marry her. So we see that someone else would be allowed to marry her if he dies. So Maskif la Rav Shisha braid Rav Idi. Rav Shisha, the son of Rav Idi, asked, Ema man acher yavam. Maybe that's specific to the case of Yibum. Yibum, yeah, we know if a man dies without children, then someone else can marry her. And that would be, I guess seemingly that would be the case over there, because there wouldn't be any children, because they haven't been married yet. Unless he was married before. So, okay, that's an interesting side point. But the Gemara is saying that maybe when it says that someone else can marry her, maybe it only means a yavam, a brother. If he dies without children, the brother can marry. But who says still that regularly, if a man dies, that the woman can go and marry someone else? So Amar Rav Ashi responded, Beis Tshuvos Badavar. He says, I have two responses to that. Chada, first of all, di yavam lo ikri acher. First of all, it says ish acher yikochena. Another man can marry her. It doesn't say the brother. It doesn't say the yavam. It sounds like another man can marry her. So we see that another man can marry her. The Od, and furthermore, Ksiv, the pasuk says, he brings another source. The pasuk says, with regards to divorce, it says usneya ha'isha acharam. If she remarries another man and he hates her, he despises her, because of la sefer krisus, and he writes her a bill of divorce, o kiyamos ha'isha acharam, or if he dies. So it says later in the pasuk. So it says next juxtaposes divorce and death. Says the Gemara, v'iskish misa legerishin. So we juxtapose and we compare death to divorce. Ma gerishin sharia v'gomeres. Just like gerishin, just like divorce makes her permitted completely to remarry, af misa sharia v'gomeres. So too, the death of the husband would permit her completely to remarry. So we have now another source for the idea that a widow can remarry. That we learn it from Gerushin. That just like a divorce is allowed to marry and it's juxtaposed with death, so too death of a husband would allow his wife to remarry and make her completely permitted. So that ends up being the final source, and right before that the Gemara brought another source where it says that if a man is at war and we say you could go home if you didn't live with your wife yet, because maybe you'll die at war and someone else will marry her, we see that if the husband dies, then someone else is allowed to marry the wife. we see that when a man dies, his wife is permitted to remarry to someone else.